The United States Navy has the absolute firepower to turn the entire mountainous coastline of the Strait of Hormuz into glass. So, the burning question across social media is why they do not simply escort those massive 20 commercial tankers through the waters. The real reason the military will not risk billion-dollar destroyers is not a lack of capability or some fear of enemy ambush. It is because the United States is completely energy independent, and letting Europe sweat over their oil is a geopolitical feature. If you think they avoid escorting because they are afraid of Iranian scuba divers with limpet mines, you are entirely mistaken. That scenario of a diver swimming after a moving vessel in strong currents is nothing more than an entertaining Hollywood myth. Hostile divers are not a strategic threat when a single active sonar ping from a destroyer can fatally disable anyone in the water. The reality is not about hidden divers, but a calculated and multi-billion-dollar game of classic area denial deterrence strategy. Their overarching military strategy is not about actually sinking the American fleet in a direct, conventional naval confrontation. It is classic area denial deterrence, creating a high-risk environment where insurance premiums alone choke the global supply chain. Today, we are looking at the actual physics and the brutal 3D battle space that makes individual escorts a tactical waste of time. If you think escorting is a simple geometry problem, this detailed breakdown will completely shatter that outdated assumption today. Welcome to our channel, where we decode why the most powerful warship in the world becomes a massive liability inside a narrow strait. You should probably subscribe right now, because the mathematical and tactical reality of this situation is about to get uncomfortable. Before the recent conflicts escalated, dozens of these massive supertankers transited through the incredibly narrow waters every day. They were carrying roughly 20 million barrels of crude oil, which represents over $1 billion in cargo value on a daily basis. That enormous volume of commercial maritime traffic has collapsed completely, and the world is currently feeling the economic shockwave. The general public assumes that simply placing an advanced warship next to these commercial vessels will instantly restore that traffic. However, that naive assumption completely ignores the geographical restrictions and the fundamental physics governing this specific region. To understand why the escort mission is doomed to fail, we must look at the massive physical burden of the cargo ships themselves. Here is exactly why we need to fundamentally understand the massive scale of what we are supposedly protecting today. A very large crude carrier is considered the absolute backbone of our modern and highly interconnected global energy transit. These massive ships are over 1,000 feet long, making them significantly wider and longer than a standard football field. Fully loaded with roughly 2 million barrels of crude oil, a single vessel displaces up to 300,000 long tons. You must think about what that extraordinary mass actually means for the tactical maneuverability of the targeted energy vessel. The required stopping distance for a fully loaded carrier is literally measured in multiple miles rather than a few dozen feet. Even at its maximum sea speed of 15 knots, the colossal ship needs several minutes just to initiate a basic course change. Now you must carefully look at the structural hull composition of these incredibly large and painfully slow commercial targets. The steel plating on these commercial vessels is engineered exclusively for structural integrity rather than combat survivability. In many critical sections of the outer hull, that protective layer of industrial steel is incredibly as thin as half an inch. There is absolutely no heavy combat armor, and definitely no blast-resistant compartmentalization to protect the volatile cargo. You will not find any dedicated damage control teams trained for incoming enemy fire on these standard commercial energy transporters. One anti-ship missile penetrating that thin hull detonates inside a massive container filled with highly flammable hydrocarbons. It is exactly like escorting a massive 18-wheel fuel truck through a remarkably narrow urban alley filled with hidden snipers. Your heavily armored military vehicle only protects your crew. It does not physically block a bullet headed for the civilian cargo. You cannot magically make the civilian tanker drive any faster. And you certainly cannot force it to turn or shrink its massive profile. The immense cargo size, combined with such an unforgiving speed, completely turns these magnificent ships into giant sitting ducks. We must deeply analyze the physical geography of the Strait of Hormuz to see why a powerful naval destroyer fails here. The incredibly narrow traffic separation scheme confines all commercial ships to a restricted corridor just 2 miles wide. These massive commercial tankers are forced to travel single file inside a dangerously narrow ribbon of shallow ocean water. The surrounding Iranian coastline is heavily mountainous, featuring sheer rock faces that drop directly into the dark ocean. A state-of-the-art Aegis destroyer carries the most capable air defense radar systems currently floating on the blue planet. However, you must deeply understand a fundamental physics rule about how microwave energy and radar technology actually behave. The protective radar signal travels in a perfectly straight line, meaning it absolutely cannot bend around solid mountain peaks. If a massive rock formation stands between the sensing antenna and the target, the scanning beam stops completely dead right there. Behind that mountainous obstacle is a massive radar shadow where nothing exists as far as the advanced ship sensor is concerned. On the open ocean, there are absolutely no obstructions between the antenna and the distant horizon to block the warning signals. But placing that exact same antenna inside a narrow valley completely breaks the functional physics of the military radar system. Every single cliff face and rocky island carves an incredibly dangerous shadow into the protective coverage of the warship radar. You never commit a multi-billion-dollar blue water asset to a close-quarters knife fight in a highly restricted littoral choke point. Deploying an Arleigh Burke destroyer is completely useless without neutralizing the enemy launch platforms on the coastline first. We must deeply analyze the primary threats of ballistic and supersonic cruise missiles launching from concealed mountain tunnels. Iran has effectively positioned mobile transporter erector launchers inside extensive tunnel complexes carved through the mountains. These massive anti-ship ballistic missiles launch from hidden mountain tunnels at supersonic velocities exceeding Mach 3 easily. A heavy ballistic missile simply does not fly in a predictable straight line from the hidden mountain launcher to the floating target. It arcs incredibly high upward into the atmosphere and deliberately drops at a remarkably steep terminal angle toward the ocean surface. From a completely concealed launch position inside a mountain tunnel to direct impact on a tanker hull takes significantly under a minute. However, the most critical tactical factor in this dangerous scenario is not the actual flight time, but the available detection window. Natural terrain masking is the ultimate asymmetric weapon that completely blinds the protective radar of the advanced naval destroyer. The powerful Aegis combat system absolutely cannot see the approaching missile until it physically clears the jagged mountain ridgeline. By the time the hostile threat finally appears on the digital scope, the defensive radar must instantly classify the incredibly fast target. The system must accurately distinguish the lethal missile from massive radar clutter bouncing off nearby canyon walls and commercial ships. The launched interceptor still requires over 10 crucial seconds of uninterrupted flight time just to reach the designated engagement point. The operational margin of error for the defending warship is terrifyingly measured in mere single-digit seconds before total vessel failure. One brief hesitation or radar delay ensures the supersonic missile hits the vulnerable tanker before the defensive interceptor ever arrives. Now we must also consider the incredibly dangerous subsonic cruise missiles flying dangerously low to avoid early detection by the warship. Once an anti-ship cruise missile clears the terrain, its terminal phase seekers activate, leaving protective systems only seconds to react. The tight geometry of the narrow strait forces the detection range to completely collapse to an incredibly dangerous 5 or 7 miles. At supersonic speeds, a distance of 5 nautical miles translates to roughly 20 terrifying seconds of available reaction time at best. In the wide open ocean, an advanced Aegis destroyer completely owns the tactical geometry, but inside Hormuz, the geometry owns the destroyer. Every massive tanker transiting this narrow choke point is literally a static, explosive target moving at an agonizingly slow walking pace. This brings us to the ultimate strategic reality that proves why individual tanker escorts are an outdated relic of World War II doctrine. The modern American military completely refuses to fight a reactive war on a flat and highly disadvantageous two-dimensional ocean surface. Instead of nervously sailing alongside vulnerable cargo ships, they utilize massive networks like C4ISR and AWACS oversight for total control. This incredibly advanced airborne network instantly elevates the entire naval conflict into a highly transparent and brutal 3D battle space. High-altitude surveillance drones and satellites completely neutralize the tactical advantage of natural terrain masking along the coastline. The defining military doctrine of this era is not defensive escorting, but the systematic elimination of hostile enemy launch infrastructure. When a conflict erupts, the armed forces will simply use precision cruise missiles to completely vaporize those hidden mountain installations. They will completely blind the enemy radar and utterly destroy the missile launchers long before any civilian tanker is actually targeted. You do not solve a complex choke point by placing your most valuable naval assets directly inside the heavily restricted coastal kill zone. You decisively win the engagement by completely destroying every single offensive threat that makes the narrow transit corridor so dangerous. The strategic implementation of continuous aerial surveillance allows the fleet to actively monitor every single hostile movement on land. By securely networking these high-altitude sensors, the military maintains absolute situational awareness over the entire mountainous region. This comprehensive data integration effectively strips away the protective shadows that enemy forces critically rely upon for their survival. Every hidden artillery piece and mobile missile transporter is continuously tracked and categorized by artificial intelligence algorithms. Any hostile action instantly triggers a devastating and highly coordinated automated response from heavily armed aircraft and distant ships. The massive cost of operating these advanced sensor platforms is completely justified by the overwhelming tactical dominance they provide. Traditional naval escorts merely react to incoming fire, while this modernized network actively prevents the initial launch from happening. You do not need to intercept an enemy projectile if your surveillance systems ensure the weapon is violently destroyed on the launch pad. This fundamentally shifts the nature of maritime security from a defensive posture into a highly aggressive and proactive hunting operation. The naval destroyer is no longer a floating shield, but a seamlessly integrated node in a global and tremendously lethal execution network. We must acknowledge that sending a highly visible surface fleet to patiently wait for an ambush is an incredible strategic vulnerability. Military commanders fully understand that trading a multi-billion-dollar warship for a cheap commercial tanker is mathematically insane. The fundamental rules of modern engagement demand that you rigorously dictate the specific time and exact location of every single battle. By utilizing overwhelming air superiority, the military effectively removes the treacherous waterway from the complicated combat equation. They force the enemy combatants to helplessly defend their land bases, rather than aggressively hunting civilian targets on the open ocean. This highly aggressive strategy guarantees the absolute safety of the fleet by meticulously keeping them safely beyond enemy missile range. Adversaries are totally paralyzed by the terrifying realization that pulling a trigger will violently invite absolute and total destruction. That is the true essence of modern American naval supremacy, where technological integration heavily outweighs sheer numbers on the water. The incredible transition from reactive surface defense to proactive aerial domination is the brilliant tactical masterpiece of this century. It permanently reshapes how we evaluate naval power and definitively proves that controlling the sky is the only way to secure the ocean. We must finally bring this harsh geopolitical reality full circle to understand the true strategic position of the United States. The undeniable truth is that the United States is currently the premier energy producer and massive exporter on the global stage. They absolutely do not rely on the fragile Middle Eastern oil pipelines to keep their domestic economy functioning and prosperous. Allowing foreign supply chains to face extreme insurance premiums and heavy logistical delays is a calculated geopolitical feature. American foreign policy intentionally forces other dependent nations to shoulder the massive financial burden of their own security. Protecting an energy supply line that overwhelmingly serves the competing economies of China and Europe is not an American priority. The powerful fleet exists to project overwhelming dominance rather than acting as a heavily subsidized security guard for the globe. When the strategic geometry fundamentally makes individual escort operations impossible, the economic consequences become unavoidable. The United States made a deliberate tactical choice to simply step back and let the incredibly harsh economic reality run its course. This brings us to the ultimate question regarding the future of international maritime security and the global economic power balance. Should American taxpayers fund billion-dollar carrier strike groups to protect an oil route that fuels both China and Europe? Or is it finally time for the rest of the dependent world to stop complaining and start building their own capable defensive navies? Let me know exactly where you stand on this highly controversial geopolitical issue by dropping your detailed thoughts in the comments.